My boss stood at the front of a packed conference room and told 40 of my coworkers that I was replaceable, that anyone with a laptop and a pulse could do what I did, and that the real talent in this agency looked like Tyler, not me. He said it smiling the way people smile when they think they're being motivational instead of cruel, the kind of smile that assumes the room is going to laugh along with him instead of wince. He had no idea that the account keeping our agency's lights on the one worth 40% of our annual revenue belonged to my family, and that the woman he'd just called replaceable was the person who could end that contract with a single signature. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what they were actually standing on top of, stay with me, because this one still gives me a strange kind of satisfaction to tell. My name is Nora. I was 36. And for 6 years I worked as a senior account strategist at a mid-sized marketing agency called Bellwether Creative, under a boss named Richard Voss, who never once asked why our biggest client only ever wanted to work with me. I liked my job genuinely for most of those 6 years, the strategy work itself, the quiet satisfaction of solving a client's actual problem instead of just impressing them. What I didn't like by the end was how invisible that kind of quiet competence could become in a room that only ever applauded the loudest presentation. My father built a small industrial supply company, Whitmore Industrial, from a single warehouse in the early 90s into a regional distributor with contracts across 4 states. He died when I was 29 quickly of a heart attack, without much chance to prepare me for the board seat I was about to inherit alongside the grief. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office 2 weeks after the funeral signing paperwork. I barely understood, and thinking that the last thing I wanted was for anyone to assume my career from that point forward was somehow a continuation of his instead of something I'd built myself. I inherited 61% of the company with my mother holding most of the rest. I never wanted to run Whitmore day to day, that wasn't where my skills were. So I kept a controlling stake, installed a capable CEO my father had trained for a decade, sat on the board, and reviewed the major decisions quarterly. What I wanted for myself was a career I'd built on my own merit, somewhere nobody would look at my work and wonder how much of it was really mine. I'd watched growing up how people treated my father differently once his business succeeded, deferential in a way that had nothing to do with him as a person, only with what he controlled. And some part of me had decided early on that I wanted at least one part of my life where people's opinion of me had nothing to do with a number in a bank account. I went into marketing strategy under my mother's maiden name, Callahan, specifically, so nobody would connect Nora Callahan, account strategist, to Whitmore Industrial, the client. I finished my MBA under that name, took my first 2 jobs under that name, and by the time Bellwether hired me, exactly nobody in my professional life beyond my own board seat knew the 2 Noras were the same person. When Bellwether Creative won the Whitmore account 4 years into my time, they're a decision made entirely by Whitmore's CEO, who valued Bellwether's actual work. Not by me pulling any strings, I made a choice I've gone back and forth on since. I didn't disclose the connection. Whitmore's leadership already knew who I was, obviously, since I sat on their board, but nobody at Bellwether ever asked, and I never volunteered it. I told myself it was a minor omission, not a lie. I was good at my job. I would have kept that account regardless of my last name. Richard built Bellwether from a 2-person operation into a 60-employee agency over 15 years. And by the time I joined, he'd developed a particular managerial style, warm to the people he considered rainmakers, dismissive toward the people he considered maintenance staff, and increasingly convinced that client relationships were won in pitch meetings, not sustained in the quiet, unglamorous work of actually doing the job well. He wasn't a cruel man in any obvious way. He remembered everyone's birthday, sponsored the office softball team, and genuinely believed he ran a fair meritocracy. He simply measured merit almost entirely by charisma, and I had never once tried to compete on that particular metric. Tyler Bragg, hired 2 years after me, was exactly the kind of employee Richard admired: charismatic, quick with a joke, excellent at closing new business, and consistently unable to retain the clients he'd won once the honeymoon period ended. One detail I noticed early and filed away the way I file away most things. Every single Whitmore renewal meeting for 4 straight years was one where Whitmore's CEO specifically requested me on the call by name, regardless of who else from Bellwether attended. Richard treated this as a mildly annoying scheduling quirk. I understood exactly why it happened. I just never explained it. I'd learned over years of watching Richard operate that he genuinely believed relationships were won in the pitch and maintained by inertia afterward, which was precisely backwards from how Whitmore actually worked. Whitmore's CEO was famously difficult to keep happy. He'd fired 2 previous agencies within 18 months each for exactly the kind of surface-level attention Richard rewarded in people like Tyler. What kept Whitmore at Bellwether wasn't charm. It was 4 years of quarterly reports delivered a day early, problems flagged before they became visible, and a strategist who happened to already understand the company's internal politics better than any outside consultant ever could, since I'd sat through board meetings discussing those exact politics since I was 29 years old. The shift started small, the way these things always do, about a year and a half before that meeting. Richard began routing new business pitches almost exclusively to Tyler, even accounts that fit my strategic strengths far better than Tyler's flashier style. When I raised it once, gently in a one-on-one, Richard said, "Tyler's got that energy clients respond to in the room. You're better at the follow-through stuff." I didn't love being reduced to follow-through stuff after 4 years of retaining Bellwether's largest account, nearly single-handedly. But I let it go the way I'd let a lot of things go by then. At a quarterly all-hands meeting, Richard presented a slide of agency MVPs for the year. Tyler's photo was on it, along with 2 other account managers. Mine wasn't, despite Whitmore alone accounting for more billable revenue than all 3 of theirs combined. Afterward in the hallway, my coworker Priya, who managed our internal reporting, whispered, "That felt off, right? You basically carry Whitmore." I told her it was fine. It wasn't particularly, but I'd learned that correcting Richard's read on who mattered cost more socially than it was worth. 6 months before that, all-hands meeting, Richard started a habit that bothered me more than the slide had, inviting Tyler into Whitmore strategy calls to shadow and learn, despite Whitmore never asking for Tyler's involvement. During one such call, Whitmore's CEO, my own board colleague, asked pointedly in front of Tyler, "Is there a reason we're expanding this call beyond Nora? We've been pretty happy with the current setup." Richard laughed it off. "Just building bench strength on our side." And I watched Tyler's ears go slightly red because even he seemed to sense he wasn't wanted on that particular call. At a team dinner celebrating a different new account Tyler had landed, Richard raised a toast and said loud enough for the whole table to Tyler, who actually goes out and hunts, "Some people on this team are great at keeping the lights on, but Tyler's the one who lights new fires." I smiled, raised my glass, and thought about the Whitmore contract renewal quietly sitting on my desk, worth more than every fire Tyler had lit in the past 3 years combined. Around the same time, during a Whitmore quarterly review, Tyler tried to insert himself into the strategic conversation by suggesting a rebrand direction. Whitmore's CEO had explicitly rejected 2 years earlier, apparently unaware of that history, because he'd never actually read the account's full file. Whitmore's CEO glanced at me, not at Tyler, and said evenly, "We tried that in year 2. Nora can walk you through why it didn't work if you're interested." Tyler laughed it off as a joke that hadn't landed. Richard, watching remotely on the call recording later, apparently only registered that Tyler had shown initiative and mentioned it approvingly at the next team meeting. A few weeks later, Priya forwarded me a message from the internal team channel, one Richard had apparently forgotten I was still copied on from an old thread. He'd written to another manager, "Nora's fine, but she's not exactly agency of the future material. We need more Tylers, less maintenance." I read it twice sitting at my desk and didn't reply to the thread at all, because I'd already learned that responding to comments like that only ever seemed to invite more of them. 3 months before the humiliation cost pressures started showing at Bellwether, a mid-sized client had left for a competitor, and Richard began talking in vague terms about restructuring for efficiency. I heard secondhand through Priya that Richard had told another manager he was considering letting some of the maintenance-heavy roles go and doubling down on new business talent. I understood by then exactly which roles he meant. 2 weeks before the all-hands meeting, Richard scheduled a casual check-in with me over coffee, the kind of meeting that always made me nervous precisely because he framed it as casual. He asked how I felt about the account leadership landscape going into next year, and when I said I felt confident in my work on Whitmore, he nodded and said, Of course. I just want to make sure we're thinking about growth areas too. Tyler's been really pushing into new verticals. I'd love to see you develop that same instinct. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't think about it much at all, because I already had an entire company's worth of instinct that Richard had simply never asked to see. If you'd been sitting in that hallway hearing your boss praise someone else for work, you were quietly doing better. Would you have said something right then, or waited to see how far it went? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I think about that hallway conversation with Priya more than almost anything else from those 2 years. The meeting where Richard called me replaceable happened on a Thursday during what he'd billed as a team alignment session ahead of the fiscal year's biggest push, the Whitmore renewal, worth just over 40% of Bellwether's annual revenue, due to be finalized within 6 weeks. Richard stood at the front of the room, 40 employees present, slides projected behind him, showing next year's growth targets, and walked through his vision for streamlining account leadership going into next year. I want to be direct with everyone, he said, because I think honesty builds trust. Some roles on this team are frankly replaceable. Anyone with a laptop and enough training could step into account maintenance work. What we need more of going into next year is people like Tyler Hunters, closers, people who bring energy into a room. He gestured toward me, not unkindly, almost as an afterthought while making his point. No offense, Nora, you do solid work. But solid isn't the same as essential. A few people in the room glanced at me, then quickly looked away, the particular kind of collective wince that happens when everyone senses something has landed wrong, but nobody's sure whether to say so out loud. Tyler, to his credit, looked visibly uncomfortable being held up as the counterexample and mouthed something like sorry in my direction from across the room, which I appreciated more than I expected to. I sat there in front of 40 coworkers and said nothing, because I was still deciding in real time what I wanted to do with what I now understood clearly. Richard was about to restructure me out of the Whitmore account, or possibly out of the company entirely, 6 weeks before a renewal that existed in its current form, because I sat on the board of the client company he was risking. After the meeting, Priya found me at my desk and said quietly, "That was completely unnecessary. Everyone in that room knows you run Whitmore." I told her I was fine. I wasn't, not entirely, but I also wasn't panicking, because I finally understood with total clarity exactly what leverage I'd been sitting on for 4 years without ever needing to use it. I spent the rest of that afternoon answering emails as if nothing had happened, partly out of habit, and partly because I needed the routine of ordinary work to settle my thinking before I decided what to do next. I spent that weekend doing something I'd never done in 6 years at Bellwether. I called Whitmore's CEO not as an employee looking for reassurance, but as a board member reviewing whether our agency relationship still made strategic sense. He was surprised to hear from me on a Saturday. I told him honestly what had happened, that Richard had publicly called me replaceable and was reportedly considering restructuring my role before the renewal. I asked him directly what Whitmore's actual position would be if my involvement in the account changed. He didn't hesitate. "We've stayed with Bellwether for 4 years specifically because of how you've run this relationship. If you're not the lead on this account going forward, I don't see a reason to renew with them at all. I'd been meaning to ask you honestly why you never mentioned the ownership stake to your own agency." I told him I'd wanted to build something on my own merit, without anyone assuming the account only existed because of my name. He said gently, "Nora, the account exists because you're good at this. The ownership stake is just the thing that means you don't have to accept being treated like you're not." He asked if I wanted him to call Richard directly to make the position clear before Monday. I told him no. Not yet that this was something I needed to walk into myself on my own terms, not have delivered for me by someone else's authority. I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up, turning it over, thinking about every meeting where I'd let a comment slide because correcting it felt like more trouble than it was worth. I thought about calling Richard that same night. I decided against it. Some conversations deserve a Monday, not a Saturday night phone call made out of anger. I spent the rest of the weekend drafting in my head exactly what I wanted to say, and exactly what I didn't, because I knew even then that the point wasn't to humiliate Richard the way he'd humiliated me. The point was to make sure he never again mistook someone's quiet reliability for their unimportance. Monday morning, Richard called me into his office to discuss restructuring the account leadership team, clearly assuming this would be a routine conversation about reassigning Whitmore to Tyler. He had a cup of coffee waiting for me the way he always did before conversations he expected to go smoothly. I brought 2 documents with me. The draft renewal contract Whitmore's legal team had sent me over the weekend, listing me not as account strategist, but as Nora Callahan Whitmore board member and controlling shareholder of Whitmore Industrial, and a printed copy of the restructuring memo Richard had already circulated to HR, listing my role as under review for elimination pending Q1 restructuring. I set both documents on his desk side by side. Before we talk about restructuring, I said I think you should read both of these. Richard glanced at the first page confused, then read further, and I watched his expression change in real-time confusion, then recognition, then something closer to genuine alarm. Whitmore Industrial, he said slowly. Controlling shareholder. Nora, is this? That's me, I said. I've sat on Whitmore's board since I was 29. I never told you because I wanted to be judged on my own work, not my family's company. But you called me replaceable in front of 40 people 6 weeks before our biggest renewal. And I think you should understand exactly what you were about to restructure. This changes things, he said, flipping back to the first page again, as if rereading it would make it say something different. Why now? Why tell me now, and not years ago? Because years ago, you never gave me a reason to, I said. I didn't need the leverage until you decided I was disposable. I want to understand something, he said. Setting the page down, did you know when I made that comment on Thursday that I could have ended us with one phone call from your client? I knew it the whole 4 years, I said. I just never had a reason to think about it that way until you handed me one. For a moment, something genuinely cracked in his face. Real fear, the kind that isn't performed, the kind that shows up when a person understands all at once exactly how close they came to losing 40% of their revenue over an ego-driven speech in a Thursday meeting. His hand actually trembled slightly against the desk as he set the memo down, and for just a second he looked less like the confident founder who'd built a 60-person agency and more like a much younger man staring down a mistake he couldn't undo. I had no idea, he said. Nora. I would never have said any of that if I'd known. That's exactly the problem, I said. You'd never have said it if you'd known I mattered financially. You said it because you genuinely believed I didn't matter at all. That's not a compliment to walk back now. Then almost immediately, I watched him reach for control again. Okay, but we can fix this. I'll pull the restructuring memo today, give you a raise, put your name on the MVP slide next quarter, whatever you need. This doesn't have to go anywhere. It already went somewhere, Richard, I said. I called Whitmore's CEO this weekend as a board member and asked what our position would be if my role changed. He told me without hesitation that Bellwether's relationship with Whitmore exists because of how I've run it, not because of anyone else on this team. I think you should hear that directly from him, not from me. So what do you want? He asked, quieter now for this not to blow up the renewal. I don't want anything from you, I said. I want you to understand that the version of this company where Tyler and people like him are the future and people like me are optional was never actually true. It just felt true to you because I never corrected it. I built this whole company, Richard said, something defensive creeping back into his voice. You're acting like I don't know how to run my own agency. You know how to win new business, I said. You've never fully understood what keeps it. That's not the same skill, and I think today is the first day you're actually being forced to see the difference. I need a minute, he said, standing up, walking to his window, looking out at the parking lot for a long moment. When he turned back around, some of the color had returned to his face, but not the same confidence. What happens now? With the renewal, I mean. That's actually up to you, I said. If I stay on this account in the role I've earned, Whitmore renews. If Tyler takes over, I already know what Whitmore's answer will be because I asked before I ever walked into this office. Richard didn't have an answer for that. He sat there, memo in one hand, contract in the other, and for the first time in 6 years, my boss looked at me like someone he'd actually have to reckon with instead of manage. I didn't stay at Bellwether much longer after that. Not out of spite, the trust had simply broken in a way a raise and an MVP slide couldn't repair. I gave 3 months' notice, helped transition the Whitmore account properly, so the company Richard had built didn't collapse on my way out. Because even after everything, I didn't want 60 other people's jobs to suffer for a decision that was entirely between Richard and me. I started my own small consultancy one where Whitmore became my first client under my actual name, not a maiden name chosen to keep two worlds separate. Bellwether kept the rest of its client roster, and as far as I know, Richard is still there, still giving toasts to whoever brings the most energy into a room. I heard secondhand that Tyler left about 8 months later for a competitor, and that Bellwether's revenue took a noticeable hit the quarter after Whitmore didn't renew at the same terms. Priya reached out a few months after I left, said she'd started keeping her own quiet record of who actually did the work on her team versus who got credit for it, just in case she said, "I ever need it the way you needed yours." I told her I hoped she'd never need it, but that it was smart to have it regardless, and that the real lesson wasn't the ownership stake at all. It was that documenting your own value quietly and consistently matters, whether or not you happen to also own the client. I don't know if Richard ever fully understood what he almost lost that Thursday, or whether he just remembers it as an unlucky coincidence instead of a pattern he built over 2 years. I've stopped needing him to understand it. Some evenings, I still catch myself replaying that Thursday meeting, wondering what would have happened if I'd stood up right then and corrected him in front of everyone, instead of waiting for Monday, whether it would have felt more satisfying in the moment, or whether the quieter version, the one where the truth arrived on my own terms, was actually the stronger choice all along. What I've come to believe sitting with all of this is that being underestimated by someone doesn't require them to be cruel on purpose. Sometimes it's just what happens when a person never once wonders whether the quiet, reliable person across the table might be the whole reason the lights are still on. If you've ever been called replaceable by someone who had no idea what you actually held up, tell me in the comments what finally made the truth impossible to ignore: a document, a phone call, a moment where the leverage you'd been sitting on quietly became something you actually had to use. If this story hit home, share it with someone who's ever been underestimated at work and subscribe because there's another story like this one waiting for you next week.